Hello and welcome to Identity Office Hours. I'm your host, Mike Schwartz, founder of Glue. Today is episode 167. The topic today is breaking through the IGA visibility wall. Our guest today is returning, Nick Hunt, CEO of StackBob.ai, who is also on episode 46. Welcome, Nick.
Thank you, Mike, for having me on today.
So episode 46, let me look it up actually. That was back in 2024, September of 2024. So it's been a while.
Yeah, this is my first time in the guest seat. I was co-hosting with you before.
So before, maybe, because it's been a year, maybe you could just reintroduce yourself and tell us what you're up to now.
Yeah, I appreciate the opportunity today. My name is Nick Hunt, CEO of StackBob.ai. Just joined the firm. The public announcement came out, I think, last Monday, so kind of hot off the presses. But 2 weeks into the new role here, since 2024 or so. Been working independently, helping a number of organizations, primarily through IANS research, listening, kind of hearing the problems, helping people evaluate this IGA space, access management, build programs, and honestly, pretty consistently, everyone's running into the same issue, right? Which is why we're building out StackBob.ai, and it's this problem with IGA. How do people integrate all their applications, right? The success metrics, for 20 plus years of doing this is 30-40%. What's that 60-70% doing? And honestly, it's a lot of manual fulfillment today. So that's what we're working on now.
Awesome. Actually, this was the statistic that we used in the episode description, and the stat that you mentioned is that there was a IGA studies that showed that enterprises integrate, 40% of their target applications, which means 60% of the applications are at risk. What do you think is the reason for that? Why do they integrate less apps than they don't integrate?
I think there's a couple of reasons that primarily drive this. One is the easy answer: application support. I like to joke, it's not a problem of technology, it's a problem of history. We've got roughly 40-50 years of this technology thing, web applications, enterprise infrastructure. The easy ones, the big core apps, have rich APIs. They have connectors. All the governance vendors out there, the SailPoint, Saviynt's, Microsoft's, name a number of them. Oracle, my background, right? They've got connectors for the big applications, right? But then you've got this huge population of newer platforms hitting the market, right? That are critical infrastructure. You've got applications people have written in-house that APIs weren't a thing, or just general user management wasn't a thing when they were written. But these are important things. So as a planning out an IGA program, you always identify those up front, and you essentially start stack ranking from there. So these 10 to 20, we've got a connector for. We can do those very easily. That next bucket is, well, there's somewhat of an API, whether it's Skim, there's a user management API that we can do generic scripting with, a number of other things. That gets you to that 30-40%, right? These are the things we know we can do. That other 60% essentially is a we'll get to it when we get to it type thing, right? And over time, that year 1, year 2 IGA budget, there's passion, everyone's driving, you've got a big team going. You get to that year or 2 and it starts getting more operational. You lose focus a little bit on it. And that 60% falls into the, hey, we'll get to it when we get to it, or, the status quo sticks around essentially, right? And that status quo is ultimately the challenge and where people start looking after that 3 to 5 years. I made an investment in, IGA platform. I implemented it, but now I still have these huge amounts of manual fulfillment or tickets that I need to create, or I don't know about this application in the corner. Who owns it? Who provisions it? It's more team tribal knowledge, those types of things. They just, I want to say they get accepted at some point, and everyone focuses on what they can get done. At StackBob.ai, we're really going after that 60%. so that we've got that picture from an IGA perspective. What is 80-90% of my identity surface look like? Now, the other kind of big thing that's starting to crop up with this visibility wall, if you want to call it, right, that 60% is a lot of the IGA platforms are starting to introduce, data analysis, AI features, role mining, role recommenders, decisions around, that 30-40% of data they have visibility into. Well, what if there's something in that 60% that contradicts the reasoning or the recommendation that comes out? Those types of issues are starting to crop up and are going to become a bigger problem here over the next couple of years.
So we were chatting before we went live.
Hmm.
We were talking about the high level architecture, and you
Yep.
mentioned that the architecture is a headless API agent. Can
Hmm.
you talk a little bit more, like how did you make this real? Like what does the architecture look like?
Yeah, I mean, there's been a number of precursors to this technology, right? If you look back, 4 or 5 years, we had bots, right? So you look at the different RPAs that are out there. You look at other just general browser automations. All those, uh, they definitely addressed a need, right? From a static task, right? I need to open a browser, I need to do X, Y, and Z and close out type thing, right? I think that moved the needle a little bit and helped out. But what it didn't do is all the feedback loops that need to come back to an IGA, right? Someone still has access, a bot fails, someone granted access that shouldn't have been granted, right? IGAs work bi-directionally. So to essentially address this problem, what we did is we said, okay, we'll use bots or other kind of static ways to push users, and then we'll do all these flat file imports. Well, then we had a kind of a separate team spin up to essentially manage all these flat files, right? Bots failed, apps weren't accessible to bots. Um, they worked in a way that bots really couldn't learn. It moved the needle incrementally, and I think it helped a lot. But at the same time, it wasn't all the way there. Where the headless agents and our technology is starting to really address those gaps, is governance can push a request, like a normal API request, but also get that feedback loop that says, one, it was successful, and two, hey, I need to run an aggregation for my certifications. It'll pull all that data in a format that those upstream IGA platforms can actually understand. And we can take the manual reconciliation processes out of the equation and make this a full bi-directional connector.
It sounds like what you're saying is that um, the technology or the agent actually helps you use SailPoint better. It's like maybe more tireless.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two big use cases here. If you look at the average implementation of a connector, right, even if it's a generic scripted one or a bot, you've got at least a couple of weeks to build out, write the scripts, everything else, right? Then you need to deploy it, you need to onboard it. You do that 200-300 times for the average organization. That's a lot of time. Where the agents and the headless agents are really accelerating things is they can learn patterns, API endpoints, normal usage activity of applications a lot faster than scripting out, you know, I hate to say browser clicks, right? So
Yeah.
our learning model and our training patterns go from a couple weeks of scripting or writing or training a bot type thing to less than 24, 48 hours and is reusable and very resilient from a change in the target application. So it's taken the generic scripting and bot development, the 2 to 3 weeks down to 24, 48 hours and making it, a lot faster overall. The other thing to think about is, running bot farms and other kind of browser extensions requires resources for organizations. So they're standing up additional IGA capabilities to manage essentially resource-intensive tasks. Moving to a headless agent, we can actually scale this a lot faster with less resources, and it's a bit more resilient in the long run.
So the headless agent is running in the cloud,
Hmm.
but there's also the user is connected to the browser. StackBob was also working on, I understand, a browser plugin. Where does the browser plugin fit in, and what can you do in the browser plugin that you can't do in the cloud?
So the browser plugin operates once a user has that stub. So if you think of a governance workflow, so to speak, right? You have an authoritative feed or an authoritative event that says, hey, this is a valid user and they need access to a target application. The first thing that generally needs to happen is you need a stub in that target application that says, this is Nick or this is Mike, and here's what he's allowed to do. The second piece is you need to manage the authentication. So we've got, products like Glue and a lot of other vendors in the space that have the modern authentication capabilities, SAML, OAuth, everything else that can do that strong assertion or modern authentication. But there's still a very large population of applications that, the medium organizations and or just aren't coded and require a password still. So that browser extension now takes care of the stub that was created and hard codes a credential behind the scenes to present a credential to that target application or stub, so to speak, so that the user doesn't have a secondary credential. You can look at
Mhm.
kind of the growth of the EPM market or Enterprise Password Manager. The browser
Yes.
extension is an extension of IGA in the sense of the credential that the user uses is managed in their browser. Now that's what the user is going to see. The bigger functionality that comes out about that browser extension is managing usage telemetry and observability, right? If you use an application once every 3 months, how does the governance or someone that's certifying your access actually know that they use it every 3 months? They just may click, Mike's a good guy and, I think he needs access to that application, but, there's really no data around the last time you used it. Since that browser extension's sitting there, we're grabbing usage data and feeding it back into the governance platform to say, hey, Mike uses it this much type thing, right? Or he's never used it, and this is a high risk, target access. So now, as you do certifications, you can start looking at things and say, yeah, Mike has this, but he's never used it, and it's costing me X amount of dollars, or there's this amount of risk associated with that level of access. So we can start enhancing those upstream governance and certification processes, via that browser extension.
Governance is a pretty bandied about word, and I've discovered that actually it doesn't mean the same thing to everybody.
Mhm.
I'm curious, what does governance mean to you?
Governance to me is that overall life cycle of the identity, right? The process, the structure of managing the person, the identity, as we talked about ahead of the call today, let's call it a principle, because now if you start looking at agents, non-human identities, other credentials that do need target access to target applications, the governance is the process around that, right? How do I get access? Who should have access? What's the review cycle on that? Um, I come from the old identity sync days, right? That was my start. It's very simple. A user comes in, it needs to sync to these targets, right? The governance overlay to me is basically the policy around that sync infrastructure. So, should I have access? How often do I need to review it? What's the policy around, what credentials, what level of access I get, if we start getting into the entitlement market. So governance to me is more the policy, the continuous evaluation, the process of the sync itself.
Um, so to lay my cards on the table, I've been writing a lot late recently about GovOps,
Mhm.
and we define the goals of governance in GovOps as risk management, um, transparency, and accountability.
Mhm.
So, to me, governance means that we're prioritizing the risks, because maybe there's so many risks, like I can't get buried in them all. I want to know what are the big ones and address those first. And transparency is like, okay, if I can't really see what's going on, then a non-transparent system is like not trustworthy. It's a black box, right? And
Mhm.
then finally, accountability is really the hook to identity, where I don't really care about identity, but when something goes wrong, I want to know, who do I blame? Is it a person, a piece of software, or an organization, or a partnership, or a business unit? Who's accountable? Is imperative, and I need to be able to know which person, which software, which organization, and that's why identity at that point is key for accountability. Um, so I'm wondering, do you think that's a reasonable way to look at it? And if you do, could you think about sort of what your offering, and how would it align with like those three goals of accountability, um, visibility, transparency, and risk management?
Yep. So risk management is going to be uh, subjective to a certain degree, right? Based on the organization, regulatory compliance, data sensitivity, level of access. If we start getting into the accountability, right? I mean, I think there's a number of things that go into risk that kind of bleed into the whole security space. Uh, as a funny aside, I was taught more of a. I had a great colleague a number of years ago that similar concept, but he called it HOS, holistic organizational survival, right? So if you look at governance as a as a general abstract concept, it's about the survivability of the process and everything else, right? So risk is going to be subjective to a certain degree. You look at some of the modern attack vectors with uh, I hate to say it, but with agents, right? The big joke being of, AI and agents are going to be the next breach source, right? I think that all that factors into the risk equation, and it's a subjective view of it, right? In terms of the accountability on the back end of it, the identity, and the transparency in the middle, this is where we're sitting in to essentially enhance the current space, right? I think there's a gap in that equation with a 30-40% visibility rate with a modern IGA. The average compliance or audit group can walk in and look at an IGA platform and say, show me your certifications for last quarter, show me who has access to this set of roles which impacts my financial controls. Well, most of the time when I've been in these rooms, it's show me the governance platform and then go run a report out of ServiceNow that someone basically manually populates a bunch of stuff. So almost instantly, if you look at it from a risk or a transparency perspective, you've got two different authorities at that point. So how do you weight risk across those? Is it universal? You know, how was one different than the other type concept? What we're doing is we're starting to pull all that into a common equation, from a GovOps, or if you're looking at it from that broad-based view, risk, now you have a complete picture. Transparency, I can see across platforms everything that Nick has that's going to impact my risk. And then an identity, is it appropriate? Has anything happened outside of my process? How did it happen? When did it happen? Who authorized it? We're fulfilling and basically feeding that model a lot faster than existing capabilities, from a governance platform.
I don't normally show a lot of graphics or pitch, glue propaganda or GovOps propaganda, but I do
Hmm.
want to quickly just show one diagram,
Hmm.
because the topic of today is about increasing IGA visibility. Um, and I have this diagram that I've been working on to show how basically visibility is one of the layers. So this is a
Hmm.
very high level view of organizational governance, where we have sort of governance at the top level. Um, Identity is a key layer for holding people accountable, but visibility is critical because we need to see who's doing what, how the system's working. We need to be able to audit it. Like the fascinating thing that you're able to show with StackBob.ai is maybe who's not using resources also is
Hmm.
part of the visibility. Like, do I know what's going on? And then finally, like, can I react to the stuff that's happening? Here's where I put like shared signal events. Oh, there's an account takeover event for this user. What do I do?
Hmm.
Um, but
I mean, if we take
yeah.
a kind of an easy example here, right? Not a good example, or depending on your view of it, right? But term events. I mean, how many, from a practitioner perspective over the years, you've got a termination event on a Friday, right? Usually it's an all hands in the current market that says, hey, at 3 o'clock or 4 o'clock on Friday, we've got this termination event. Basically, everyone sits and says, okay, HR authoritative feed has come through, right? So
Mhm.
IGA platform picks it up, takes care of what it can do, and then everyone else essentially starts inventorying their applications. Does Nick have access to this? Yes, he does. Disabling access. So it's kind of this all hands fire drill, so to speak, right? When these types of things happen. Increasing that visibility is essentially going to pass through to those events that now say, hey, an authoritative feed came in. I can see everything Nick has access to. And by submitting those API requests, letting the governance platform do what it's supposed to do, it can reach out and start taking care of that without that kind of all hands so to speak, of cleaning that stuff up. On the back end of it, if we do kind of a bottom up approach to that event, hey, Mike logged into this target platform and made Nick an admin. Do we wait to the next cycle of a flat file being imported, or you run kind of a quarterly report for a certification to know that Nick got that admin access? Now you've got potentially 2 months and 29 days of risk sitting there for a rogue event. Or during a normal aggregation, within hours, you can start picking up these events and say, hey, why did Mike grant Nick access? So we're really closing that risk window if we're looking at it from a bottom-up approach.
So, as somebody who has a lot of experience with IGA tools, how good of a job are current IGA tools at telling you what your risk is and that you've done a good job mitigating all of your risks?
I'd say over the last couple 5 to 10 years, they're getting very good, right? You look at the KIM market, the entitlement management, right? The external feeds, the ITDR capabilities. Even looking at some of the other kind of newer acronyms coming out, the IVIP, the intelligence, and visibility concepts, right? We're getting very good about what we can see and know about, right? The analytics of saying, hey, this looks like an admin or an elevated set of privileges. Let's bubble up in a certification or a risk profile for a user that it looks like this. I think the governance platforms themselves are very good at the data analysis based on what they can see, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's what they can't see that is going to start moving that needle a little bit. If I'm looking at 30% of the equation, right, and I determine that Nick is very high risk, which, Nick's a shady guy sometimes, all joking aside, right? If I'm, high risk at 30%, but all of a sudden I get visibility across everything and I'm not, that risk score that it's seeing today could be askew a little bit, right? Or I could have admin access to something random in the corner and I'm low risk right now. So from an automated approval perspective, if we start looking at kind of where the market's going from a IGA platform perspective, those decisions could be askewed. Now, the scary part for me, thinking about that equation, if there's a decision based on my risk profile, based on something it doesn't know about me, who's accountable for that decision, right? Auditor comes in and says, hey, Nick was granted this, and someone said he was low risk and granted it, but he's got this ultra sensitive access over here. How do we essentially track back to say a decision was made, here's the outcome, who's accountable, kind of in the middle there? So by breaking through that visibility barrier right between the identity and event in the GovOps model there, we're really informing so we can start confidently saying, yes, the decision was made, here's why, and having a complete picture of everything.
It's interesting the way you phrase it of Nick being high risk or low risk, because I don't see people as necessarily inherently risky, although you might say, do I have more or less confidence in the strength of this identity association between this session that I have and Nick the person? Am I less, or how sure am I that Nick is actually attached to this browser? But I see fundamentally the capabilities are the things that actually have the risk. So, like the example I like to use is my car. So, wash car and drive car have two different risk profiles, right? Now, whether Nick performs either of those actions it's almost like a non sequitur. And so I wonder if the thing that I'm wondering is IGA by looking at the people as the things that it's indexing is sort of not even able to really talk about the risk. What are the capabilities, the digital capabilities of the company? Which are the high risk capabilities? Which are the low risk versus looking at the people?
Yeah, so let's kind of broaden the horizon of risk just from a concept perspective, right? I think arguably there are three main components of every identity stack, right? So you've got IGA, which is, I like to call it Newton's third law. It's for every input, there's an output, right? policy says I'm a valid employee or I'm a valid principal, right, for looking at NHIs and everything else. What should I be able to do? Did I request something get approved, whatever it may be? It's the glue, it's the plumbing, it's the data foundation if we look at it from an identity data warehouse, right? Now, that is periodically reviewed just from a level of access, organizational risk, who has access to sensitive applications. Now, where we start getting into other concepts of risk is let's look at privileged access management. Do I have access to a certain set of vaulted credentials, right? Are those vaulted credentials high risk from a target system perspective, right? Just looking at governance by itself from a risk profile perspective doesn't necessarily say I'm high risk, but all of a sudden I've got an admin account in the PAM utility that I can enact change inside of a Active Directory, let's say, right? I've got a secondary admin account that I can assume. Now, let's start looking at access. Am I coming in from outside? Is this normal? Do I do this on a day-to-day basis? Those other concepts are more historical. So if we're using your analogy from driving a car risk versus washing a car risk, how often do I drive, right? Am I driving above my normal speed today? Those types of concepts are all going to be at that enforcement, basically mapping back to me in my profile, so to speak. So I think governance is that foundation of says, here's everything I could possibly do, right? The big risk equation is going to start coming in. What am I doing in that context? And I'm talking about me as an interactive person. As we talked about before, when we're talking about the authorization frameworks, right? A principal, identity, whatever you want to, terminology you want to use, is an abstract concept anymore. This could be a system. It could be something on my behalf. If we start looking at the delegation protocols, right? The on behalf of extensions. Um, the identity, I think, is just a core construct at this point, which is a level set. Here's Nick, or here's a principal. Here's everything he may or may not have access to, right, at a certain point in time. Now there's history, and then there's other systems that define basically privileged access I may have. But at the end of the day, IGA is that foundational starting point to define a principle.
Would you say, Bob Blakely, the former Gartner analyst, you might know him. You remember
Mm-hmm.
Bob?
Yep.
He was on the live stream and he was talking about two approaches to security. One is sort of, let's say control access or prevent access or sanction. So, in the real world, we tend to sanction. Like we don't stop you from speeding, but we're going to give you a ticket if we catch you.
Mm-hmm.
And so, those 60% of applications, maybe you can insert yourself into the decision flow. But is what you're saying like, okay, maybe we can't quote unquote integrate these applications, but we can at least observe these applications and understand if they're aligning with our security objectives or if they're breaking any rules. Is that the idea?
I think all the above. Integrating them is going to feed that core identity model that you can start making informed risk decisions, right? At the end of the day, I don't think, as a security professional, back in the day, I got the moniker Dr. No, right, or Mr. No, whatever you want to call it, right? It was more that prevent attitude. I think the sanction kind of moniker is where we've moved over the years of like, yes, we want to allow it, but under certain situations or certain contexts. Have I been approved? Am I on an approved device? Have I MFA'd properly? Everything else. But to be able to make those decisions to kind of sanction it, in that context, you have to know about it first. And I think that's one of the major challenges with the identity market today is we're moving so fast, moving to these cloud platforms and everything else. And honestly, I was talking to a friend this morning about the kind of agent coding architecture, right? Where someone can log in, they have an idea for an application, they can spin it up and organizations start using it. I mean, we're accelerating at a pace right now of new applications that, we have a big gap of even what's out there, what people are using, everything else, so that we can say, yes, this is appropriate, it's not appropriate. That gap is, largely just a visibility gap at this point.
So I worry about extending the human identity governance paradigm into software identity.
Mhm.
And yet I hear a lot of firms wanting to do that, where they want to say, okay, we used to make we would inventory the people, verify and certify their roles and map those roles to permissions. And now we have these new entities, software agents or software bots, and we're gonna onboard them and sort of manage them in the same way. Make sure that this agent has the right entitlements.
Mhm.
Um, are you worried by that? And do you think that this model is really going to extend, or will we be able to extend the the identity governance model to software entities?
Uh, I think that's where it needs to go, in terms of extending the identity idea to software entities, right? But I think the gap or the disconnect is we're looking at it as an individual today. Like an agent is an individual. Um, where we where I think we need to go is more it's on behalf of an individual. So there's kind of this sub identity construct. You're not creating an agent in a target application per se, or a representation of a software entity in a target application. You're essentially allowing a user to create a representation of themselves in a target application, because 9 times out of 10 it's either going to be the org or someone in the org, you know, asking these software entities to operate in an application. I think today, given the market, like how we authenticate things, um, how we manage users, like general concepts, we're looking at it as individuals, as NHIs, right? What's the current statistic? Is it 80 to 1? Last time I read it was 120 to 1, kind of non-human identity representations of users, right? Like 1 to 120. Um, where we can start paring that back is to say, you know, here's Nick, he has access to a target system, or here's a principal, from a system or service to service type communication. And here's a representation of that entity or person and what they should be able to do using this capability, right? I think looking at it as an individual outside of a managed principal, you're giving it very broad-based access to a certain degree. So I think it's what we're doing today is needed, right? Because this is growing. But at the same time, I think it's naturally going to evolve to being tied to some kind of central entity, whether that's a person or a non-person, right? And very specific permissions. So that way, it's not so much about managing individual principles in a target application. It's going to be managing essentially the parent, so to speak.
The whole idea of digital identity is based on this like impedance mismatch between organic and cyber, worlds, where we like to say, oh, this is Mike doing this on this system, but really, I can't speak TCP/IP or HTTPS or TLS, and so really, there's a piece of software that's acting on my behalf, maybe interacting with an agent who's then interacting with other agents downstream. And those downstream agents, are past some evidence that this original piece of software had a connection to a human. Um, but making the leap that it is me doing this, is hard to convey over multiple trust boundaries. Um, and so ultimately, I wonder if we're sort of making this leap that it is the person when that's really a fallacy. All we have is a bunch of tokens, and we need to make policies based on the evidence that we have that it was actually Nick at the beginning of the transaction. So, any thoughts around the challenges there in the trust model?
Yeah, I mean, it really goes back to, bringing up your GovOps, example, that initial risk discussion, right? What's your assurance level, from a downstream that this is done on behalf of someone else, right? Do you include something in the token? Is it a specific protocol? Is it, there's a number of things that we could potentially start building into those assurances downstream, so to speak, that says, yes, this was done by a person or is authorized by a person, and here's basically the accountability, the trust chain, so to speak, that it was done by a person and they've authorized it. I think more often than not, the scary part for me is someone, for lack of a better term, delegated their credentials to one of these entities, and it's operating with their full authority without any real accountability or consent, so to speak, for certain tasks. Until we can kind of build those trust chains, those delegation models, and tie them to that initial trust or consent, so to speak, it's going to be. I think we've got a lot of these questions today.
I've heard stories about people installing agents like Claude agents in their browser
Hmm.
and having the browser impersonate the person, um, use their session cookies and to present them to websites and to do stuff. Um, is that a crazy idea, or is that just going to happen? And how could StackBob help you actually, if it is going to happen? How could StackBob help you like get more visibility into what's going on?
So if we look at the, was it Comet? Is it Comet that, or no, Atlas is OpenAI's browser, right? You've got the Anthropic Comet browser. There's a number of the essentially browser-based agents that are coming out, right? That's more on the consumer side, right? But as that starts bleeding into the enterprise space, let's start thinking about that a little bit. StackBob.ai is primarily workforce identity governance, right? You start looking at enterprise versions of Atlas, so to speak. How do I essentially authorize my browser to execute on my behalf a specific task? Let's kind of break it down into individual concepts, right? And then
Mhm.
how does that target system know that it was actually authorized? So I think a couple of things need to come up, early on in this conversation, just from a policy perspective. And I'm going to use a pun here, but from a governance perspective, what's the policy, the process, that life cycle of actually doing the delegation? I think there's a number of things that need to happen, right? One, the governance utility or framework, right, tool needs to understand that, yes, I am going to allow this, and here's how, right? User needs to kind of go through the process, request it. It's part of my RBAC or reback or whatever back model we want to put in place here, that I can do these types of things, right? So once I am allowed from a business process perspective, how does the target application know I should be allowed and how it should look, right? That's where StackBob steps in, and these connectors, and everything else. Is governance says yes, hands it off to StackBob. StackBob goes and creates the stubs that essentially say I should be able to do something. Now that target application, from an authentication perspective, needs to understand two things. One, an agent's going to be doing something and how to essentially understand or recognize an agent. And then two, how to essentially look at its local stub and say, yes, Nick should be able to do something like this, right? So from a governance perspective in StackBob.ai, we're sitting under the covers that says, hey, target application, Nick is authorized to do this, and here's how his account's going to look from a fine-grained permissions perspective when it's represented by one of these agents type thing. And then your upper level access management that actually does that delegation or hands off a specially formatted token, it's going to take that same data and say, yes, Nick should be able to do a delegation, and here's the type of token that is going to issue so the target application can understand it. So if you think about it, StackBob's sitting under the covers and saying, yes, I should be able to do something, and here's how I define that in the target application. The access management privilege layer is going to sit on top of that and essentially structure the data so that everything understands what's actually going on.
Um, last question,
Mhm.
and then go to last thoughts. But it's StackBob.ai.
Mhm.
What's the AI part of it, or which models are you using, or can you give us any insights into how you're using AI?
Yeah, so the AI really is the application learning and training under the covers, right? So one of our co-founders, Yarek, he wrote a custom model for this agent that essentially is the learning model right? So through our browser extension or through our training tools on the back end, we can walk through an application. It's learning those patterns, whether it's button clicks, the API endpoints, the data formatting, everything else. So that pipeline, instead of headless agents, is actually our model that we built for training and running these things. So that's the AI piece of it. Today, going forward, there's a number of other things we're looking at. I mentioned it earlier. If you look at it provisioning, you've got rich connectors, ICF, you've got SCIM, and then you've got kind of user and groups, and then you've got the scripted kind of targets, so to speak, right? If you look at application connector in an IGA today, ICF and the scripting are probably the most feature rich, right? But take the most time to get done. SCIM is fairly straightforward to get going, but it doesn't cover all the use cases from a fine grained permission. So if we start extending out from AI perspective and making decisions, we're going to get to a point in that pipeline that says, hey, you know what, this target application has a SCIM interface, but SCIM only accounts for the user stub and maybe a basic group. Those fine-grained permissions are manual fulfillment today. So we can actually start comboing technologies in that engine that says, hey, I'm going to go do a SCIM connection, get a response, and then I'm going to go use my headless agent to do the fine-grained permissions as one transaction. Now we don't need the combination fulfillment request from a normal identity governance plan. So we're really building that out, and that's the modeling under the covers that we're building.
The birds are flying, so it's telling us that we're going to last thoughts. So before we break, what are any last thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, a couple of last thoughts. We are opening up, looking for design partners right now. So what I mean by that is, if you look at Microsoft, SailPoint, paying the big governance players out there, we're trying to enhance existing capabilities, right? That 30-40%, we want to take it to 80-90%. So if you've got a SailPoint today, paying Microsoft and want to get in, definitely reach out. We want to help gain visibility in identity governance. And the second part I want to say is, we are going to be starting a seed round here in April, Q2 of 2026. So definitely look for news this year as we really accelerate and grow this platform. It's super exciting for us to kind of bring this to market, and we're looking to enhance the existing IGA capabilities.
Awesome. I will just take a quick moment to remind people to subscribe to Identity Office Hours. That helps us a lot on YouTube or LinkedIn. Both platforms are good for us. The next episode, Safe MCP and GovOps will be the topic, with Rohit Kaur and Frederick Kautz. So looking forward to that episode next Tuesday. Nick, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you, audience, and we'll see you next time.
And thanks for having me on again today. 46 to 167. So hopefully